You can tell a lot about a person by how quickly a room decides they don't belong. Rain hammered against the glass walls of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, hard enough to blur the Manhattan skyline into silver streaks of light. Black sedans lined the curb outside, while men in tailored coats hurried beneath umbrellas worth more than some people's rent. Inside, the annual Whitmore Biotech Innovation Gala glowed with polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and the low hum of money speaking softly to itself. Waiters floated through the ballroom carrying trays of champagne while investors laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Every surface reflected status. Every smile felt rehearsed. And then the elevator doors opened. Dr. Elijah Brooks stepped into the lobby wearing a dark charcoal suit that had been pressed carefully but too many times. Rainwater clung to the shoulders of his old brown coat. In one hand, he carried a worn leather backpack with the corner of a child's drawing sticking out near the zipper. Crayon stars, purple marker, a crooked little heart. The receptionist glanced up once before her expression flattened into professional indifference. Not rude, worse, dismissive. Delivery entrances around back, sir. Elijah blinked softly. Tired eyes, calm eyes. I'm here for the gala, he replied. His Mississippi accent rolled slow and warm beneath the cold New York lighting. The receptionist hesitated just long enough to make the silence sting. Then she checked the guest list again. Dr. Brooks? That's right. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Somewhere behind her, a man in a tuxedo whispered under his breath. The country doctor actually came. Quiet laughter followed. Not loud enough to confront, just loud enough to wound. Elijah heard it. Of course he did. Men like him learned early how to hear things people thought they hid well. But he only thanked the receptionist, adjusted the strap on his backpack, and walked deeper into the ballroom with the steady posture of someone who had spent most of his life entering rooms not built for him. The gala sparkled around him like another planet. Women in diamond earrings drifted beneath gold light. Men discussed biotech acquisitions while staring into glasses of 15-year scotch. Giant digital screens rotated Charlotte Whitmore's face above the ballroom floor, beside glowing company slogans about changing the future of medicine. She was impossible to miss even before she entered the room. Charlotte Whitmore moved through people the way storms move across water. Controlled, powerful, effortless, from a distance. Her white gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light, while executives shifted around her orbit trying to keep pace. Phones buzzed constantly near her. Assistants whispered updates into wireless earpieces. Investors watched her with hungry attention. But Elijah noticed something no one else did. Her left hand trembled once as she reached for her champagne glass. Small, barely visible, then gone. He frowned slightly. Across the ballroom, Charlotte smiled at another group of donors without really seeing them. The smile never reached her eyes. And for one strange second, standing alone near the back wall with rain still drying on his coat, Elijah felt something he couldn't explain. Not attraction, not admiration, recognition. The kind that comes when one exhausted person quietly notices another. There are moments when the human body whispers for help long before it screams. Most people miss those moments because they are too busy performing. Charlotte Whitmore stood beneath the chandelier lights, answering questions about biotech expansion, while cameras flashed against polished silver walls. Her voice remained smooth, precise, controlled, but the tremor in her fingers returned when she reached for her glass again. This time it lasted longer. Elijah noticed the slight stiffness in her wrist, the delayed blink afterward, the way her shoulders tightened as if her body suddenly weighed more than it had 5 minutes earlier. Around her, nobody noticed anything at all. Investors laughed beside towering floral arrangements. A senator from Connecticut complimented the company's latest pharmaceutical breakthrough. Somewhere near the orchestra platform, two surgeons debated private hospital mergers while sipping bourbon that smelled like oak and smoke. The room kept moving because wealthy rooms always do. They moved fast enough to avoid seeing discomfort. Elijah stood near the back wall, quietly watching Charlotte lower her champagne glass untouched. Her assistant leaned close to whisper something into her ear. Charlotte nodded once, but her focus drifted somewhere far beyond the ballroom. For a second, her eyes lost the room entirely. Elijah felt his stomach tighten. He had seen that look before: small rural emergency rooms, understaffed clinics during hurricane season, people trying to remain functional seconds before their bodies surrendered. He stepped forward slightly. then stopped himself. Across the ballroom, Charlotte adjusted the microphone near the stage podium, while applause rose around her. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. Her voice carried cleanly through the ballroom speakers, elegant and practiced. "Innovation only matters when it improves human life. That belief has guided Whitmore Biotech from the beginning." More applause followed. Phones lifted to record her. Investors smiled proudly. But Elijah barely heard the speech anymore. He was watching the way Charlotte pressed her fingertips briefly against the edge of the podium, as if steadying herself. Her breathing had changed, shallow now, uneven. Then came the smallest mistake. One word delayed half a second too long. Most people would never notice. Elijah did. Charlotte blinked hard beneath the lights. The ballroom blurred around her for just an instant. She tried to continue speaking anyway. "The future of medicine depends on our willingness to—" Her sentence stopped. Silence flickered across the room. Charlotte's hand slipped from the podium. The champagne glass beside her shattered against the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the ballroom as her body staggered sideways. An assistant lunged forward too late. Charlotte collapsed before anyone fully understood what they were seeing. Suddenly, the polished room cracked open. Heels scraped against marble. People shouted over each other. Security moved toward the stage while guests stepped back in panic, clutching phones and drinks like shields against uncertainty. "Call emergency services. Get the medical team. Move back." Voices collided beneath the chandeliers. Charlotte lay motionless beside broken glass, her breathing strained and uneven. One of the gala physicians dropped to his knees beside her immediately, while another barked instructions into a headset. Expensive suits crowded around her in confusion. Elijah moved closer now. Calm, quiet, focused. And then he saw it. The subtle rigidity along Charlotte's jaw, the faint discoloration near her fingertips, the strange delay in her eye movement when the doctor lifted her eyelid toward the ballroom lights. Elijah's expression changed. Not fear, recognition. Somewhere deep beneath the panic and noise, something did not fit. The strange thing about panic is how quickly intelligent people become useless inside it. The ballroom had transformed from polished elegance into confusion wrapped in expensive fabric. Men who managed billion-dollar portfolios stood frozen near the stage, clutching untouched whiskey glasses. Women in diamond necklaces whispered over being friends on hands. Security guards pushed people backward while flashes from cell phone cameras lit the room in nervous bursts of white light. Charlotte Whitmore lay near the shattered remains of her champagne glass, her breathing shallow and strained beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Two physicians from the Gala Medical Advisory Board knelt beside her immediately. One loosened the collar of her gown, while the other checked her pulse with quick, irritated movements. "Heart rate is unstable," one muttered. "Get oxygen here now," another voice barked for emergency responders. Elijah stepped closer through the crowd, eyes fixed on Charlotte's face. Her pupils were reacting unevenly now. Tiny muscle tremors moved along her jawline. Sweat glistened across her forehead despite the cool ballroom air. Something about it felt deeply wrong. Not random, not simple. One of the physicians reached for a syringe from the emergency kit, while another attempted to stabilize her breathing. "Possible cardiac event," the taller doctor announced loudly enough for the room to hear. "Prepare epinephrine." Elijah stopped moving. His expression sharpened instantly. "No," he said quietly. Nobody heard him over the noise. The doctor prepared the injection anyway. Elijah stepped closer. "That is not her heart." This time, the nearest physician looked up sharply. Mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of face used to authority. "Excuse me?" Elijah pointed gently toward Charlotte without taking his eyes off her condition. "Look at her pupils, the muscle rigidity, her breathing pattern." Something neurological triggered this. The doctor stared at him for half a second before annoyance hardened across his face. "Sir, please step back. If you give her epinephrine right now, you could make this worse." Another physician glanced over Elijah's shoulder and frowned at the sight of the old brown coat and worn backpack. "Who are you?" Elijah answered calmly. "Dr. Elijah Brooks, family medicine." A younger surgeon nearby let out a quiet laugh before he could stop himself. "Family medicine?" Another voice muttered from behind the crowd. "The country doctor wants to run the ballroom now." More restrained laughter followed. Quick, nervous, condescending. Elijah ignored it. Charlotte's fingers twitched weakly against the marble floor. He noticed the faint bluish tint beginning near her nail beds. Her breathing hitched again. Too slow now. She is reacting to something systemic, Elijah said firmly. Maybe a neurotoxic interaction. Maybe medication overlap. But this is not presenting like a primary cardiac collapse. The silver-haired physician stood abruptly. Sir, with all due respect, this woman is the chief executive officer of one of the largest biotech companies in the country. I am not taking emergency instruction from a rural clinic doctor. Elijah held his gaze without anger. I understand. Then step aside. Around them, the ballroom tightened with tension. Some guests looked embarrassed for Elijah. Others watched with open curiosity, hungry for conflict the same way wealthy people often are when they believe it cannot touch them personally. But Elijah was not looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at Charlotte, at the subtle stiffness spreading through her arms, at the delayed eye response nobody else seemed willing to see. Somewhere beneath the noise and ego and polished marble, her body was running out of time. And for the first time that night, Elijah Brooks stopped sounding polite. If you treat the wrong problem, he said quietly, she is not going to survive this. Sometimes the difference between life and death is not intelligence, it is humility. The ballroom had grown strangely quiet after Elijah's warning. Not silent, never silent. Wealthy rooms hated silence because silence forced people to feel things they usually paid to avoid. Instead, the air filled with nervous whispers, hurried footsteps, and the metallic clatter of medical equipment being unpacked too quickly. Charlotte Whitmore's breathing had become uneven beneath the chandelier light. Her chest rose sharply, then paused too long before falling again. Sweat dampened strands of blonde hair against her temple, while the physicians around her argued in clipped, urgent voices. We do not have time for this. Her pulse is destabilizing. Get the ambulance team upstairs now. The silver-haired physician reached again for the injection kit. Elijah's jaw tightened. Please stop. The doctor snapped toward him immediately. You are not in charge here. No, Elijah answered softly, but she is getting worse. Another spasm flickered through Charlotte's hand against the marble floor. Small, involuntary. Her breathing hitched again. One of the younger assistants covering her mouth suddenly whispered, "Oh my God." Everyone looked down. A faint rash had begun creeping along Charlotte's neck beneath the stage lights. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just wrong. Elijah crouched lower without touching her. His eyes moved carefully across every symptom. The others were too distracted to connect. What medications is she taking? Nobody answered him. Did she start a new treatment recently? Still nothing. The silver-haired physician finally exhaled sharply through his nose. This is an acute cardiovascular event complicated by stress response. Elijah looked up at him directly. Then why are her pupils delayed? The doctor froze. Just for a second. Why the muscle rigidity? Elijah continued quietly. Why the neurological response pattern? Another silence settled across the ballroom. Not mockery this time. Uncertainty. Elijah noticed Charlotte's assistant trembling near the edge of the stage, clutching a tablet against her chest. Young woman, late 20s, terrified. He turned toward her gently. Miss? She blinked at him. Has she changed medications recently? The assistant hesitated. The physicians exchanged irritated looks. Answer him, Elijah said calmly. The young woman swallowed hard. There was a new experimental treatment trial. The ballroom shifted again. Investors looked at one another uneasily. One of the surgeons frowned. What kind of trial? Neurological performance enhancement, the assistant whispered. For stress, resilience, and cognitive fatigue. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. There it was. He looked back at Charlotte immediately. How long ago? 3 weeks. Dosage? I do not know. The silver-haired doctor cursed under his breath for the first time all night. Elijah leaned closer to Charlotte, watching the tiny tremors near her jaw intensify. This is not cardiac failure, he said firmly now. This is toxic neurological overload. Her nervous system is crashing. One physician scoffed nervously. And you diagnosed all that from across the room? Elijah finally looked at him fully, calm, steady, unmoved by the room's opinion. No, he said. I diagnosed it because I have seen it before. The physician frowned. Where exactly? Elijah's eyes drifted briefly toward Charlotte, struggling for breath beneath the ballroom lights. Mississippi, he answered quietly. After chemical exposure during flood cleanup. We lost 6 people before we understood what we were looking at. The room fell still again. Different this time. The arrogance had started cracking. Not because Elijah raised his voice, because he never did. Charlotte's fingers twitched weakly against the marble. The monitor attached beside her gave another unstable reading. One of the younger doctors looked at the silver-haired physician with visible fear now. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "what if he is right?" The room changed the moment fear entered the doctor's eyes. Not panic, fear. Because panic is loud, but fear goes quiet. The silver-haired physician looked down at Charlotte Whitmore lying beneath the ballroom lights, then back toward the unstable monitor readings flashing beside her. For the first time all night, uncertainty cracked through his authority. Around them, the ballroom had become painfully still. Nobody cared about champagne anymore. Nobody cared about stock prices or media coverage or billion-dollar acquisitions. A woman was struggling to breathe on a marble floor, and suddenly all the polished confidence in the room felt thin as paper. Elijah stayed crouched beside Charlotte, watching every movement carefully. Her jaw had tightened further. Tiny tremors rippled through her fingers. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls now, each one weaker than the last. He had seen this progression before. Rural cleanup workers after chemical exposure, volunteer crews trapped near contaminated floodwater, men too stubborn to admit something was wrong until their nervous systems began shutting down one signal at a time. The silver-haired physician finally spoke, slower now. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Elijah answered immediately. "You have to interrupt the neurological overload before respiratory failure worsens." One of the younger doctors frowned. "With what?" Elijah looked toward the emergency case near the stage. "Magnesium, fluids, lower sensory stimulation, no epinephrine." The younger surgeon blinked. "That protocol is outdated." Elijah nodded once. "So is surviving hurricanes with 1 generator and 3 nurses. Sometimes old methods stay alive because they work." Nobody laughed this time. Charlotte's assistant stepped closer, trembling visibly. "Please," she whispered, "do something." Elijah looked toward the silver-haired physician one last time, not challenging him, giving him a choice. The older doctor stared at Charlotte for several heavy seconds before finally stepping backward. Pride moves slowly when men had built entire careers around being right. "Fine," he muttered tightly. "But if this fails, she dies anyway if we wait." Elijah's voice stayed calm. Matter of fact. The room opened around him almost reluctantly as he moved beside Charlotte fully now. He slipped off his old brown coat carefully and folded it beneath her head to stabilize her neck against the marble floor. The gesture felt strangely human inside all that polished luxury. He adjusted the ballroom lights downward immediately. "Too much stimulation," he explained quietly. "Her nervous system is overloaded already." One assistant dimmed the stage lighting, while another brought the supplies Elijah requested. His hands never shook, not once. Steady hands. Hands shaped by years of holding frightened people together in places nobody televised. Elijah checked Charlotte's pulse again, then monitored her breathing rhythm with focused silence. "Charlotte." He said her name softly for the first time. Not because he expected an answer, because sometimes people fought harder when they heard another human voice refusing to leave them alone. "You need to stay with me." Around him, the ballroom watched in complete silence now. Wealthy executives, famous surgeons, investors worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all staring at the quiet black doctor they had dismissed less than 20 minutes earlier. Elijah administered the magnesium carefully while monitoring her response second by second. "Come on," he murmured softly. "Slow your breathing." Another tremor hit her arm briefly, then weaker still. The tension along her jaw eased almost imperceptibly. Elijah noticed it first. Of course he did. He leaned closer, eyes locked on her breathing pattern. One inhale, then another, deeper now, more stable. The room held its breath with her. Then suddenly Charlotte gasped sharply and pulled in a full, clean breath for the first time since collapsing. Audible, real, alive. A collective exhale swept through the ballroom like a wave breaking against stone. One assistant burst into tears quietly near the stage. The younger surgeon stared at Elijah in stunned disbelief. Even the silver-haired physician looked shaken now. But Elijah barely noticed any of them. He was still focused on Charlotte, watching carefully as color slowly returned to her fingertips beneath the chandelier light. The most dangerous thing about pride is that it does not disappear when the truth arrives. It just gets quieter. Charlotte Whitmore lay beneath the dimmed ballroom lights, breathing steadily now, while emergency responders finally rolled through the hotel entrance with equipment that suddenly felt unnecessary. The room parted for them automatically, but the urgency had changed. The panic was gone. In its place sat something far heavier: shock. Elijah remained kneeling beside Charlotte for several more seconds, monitoring her pulse with patient concentration, while the ballroom watched him the way people watch a storm, after realizing it spared them. Nobody spoke at first. The younger physicians exchanged uncertain glances while the silver-haired doctor slowly removed his glasses and rubbed tension from the bridge of his nose. Around them, whispers spread quietly through the ballroom. Who is he? How did he know? Did you hear what he diagnosed? But Elijah barely seemed aware of any of it. He adjusted the folded coat beneath Charlotte's head one last time before carefully standing. His knees stiffened slightly as he rose. Long clinic hours, too many years on hard floors beside frightened people. One of the paramedics approached quickly. Sir, what was administered? Elijah answered calmly, listing the medications and neurological symptoms with precise clarity. The paramedic's expression shifted halfway through, respect replacing assumption in real time. Nearby, the younger surgeon who had laughed earlier stared at Elijah with visible discomfort. You recognize the toxicity response immediately, he said slowly. Elijah nodded once. Not immediately. Still faster than all of us. The younger doctor swallowed hard. Where did you train? It was not asked, mockingly anymore. Elijah glanced briefly towards Charlotte as emergency staff stabilized her onto a transport stretcher. Mississippi Delta, Regional. Silence. Followed the answer. A few people in the ballroom frowned slightly, as if expecting a more impressive name. Ivy League hospitals, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, somewhere expensive enough to validate expertise. The younger surgeon blinked. I have never heard of it. Most people have not. Elijah's tone remained gentle. The silver-haired physician stepped closer now, studying him carefully beneath the ballroom lights. Brooks, he repeated quietly. Your name sounded familiar. Elijah said nothing. The older doctor looked at him for several long seconds before something shifted across his face. Recognition. Real recognition. Wait, he frowned harder. You wrote the flood neurotoxicity response paper 12 years ago. Nearby physicians turned immediately. What? The older doctor pointed at Elijah slowly now. The emergency field stabilization protocol used after the Mississippi chemical flooding. We studied portions of it during residency. The ballroom fell completely silent again. Elijah looked almost uncomfortable by the attention. It was a team effort. That protocol saved dozens of people, the older physician continued quietly. Why are you working family medicine in rural clinics? Elijah slid his hands into the pockets of his old coat calmly. Because people there still get sick. No speech, no bitterness, just truth. The simplicity of the answer landed harder than arrogance ever could. Across the ballroom, one investor lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The receptionist near the entrance stared at Elijah like she was replaying their earlier interaction in her head and hating every second of it. Charlotte's assistant approached slowly, tears still lingering in her eyes. Dr. Brooks, she whispered, you saved her life. Elijah looked toward the stretcher, where Charlotte was being prepared for transport. Her breathing had stabilized completely now. Color had returned softly to her face beneath the dim ballroom light. He nodded once. Quietly. She is not fully safe yet, he replied, but she is going to make it. Then, before anyone could surround him with more questions or apologies or admiration that arrived too late, Elijah reached down, picked up the little backpack he had placed near the stage earlier, and checked the time on his old phone screen. 8:43. His expression softened immediately. He opened his voicemail and listened to a tiny voice say, Daddy, do not forget we promised pancakes tomorrow. And for the first time all night, Elijah Brooks smiled. Hospitals after midnight always felt different from the rest of the world. Quieter, more honest somehow. The elevators at St. Vincent Medical Center opened with soft mechanical chimes, while exhausted nurses moved through pale blue hallways, carrying coffee cups and patient charts under dim fluorescent light. Outside the windows, Manhattan still glowed, restless and awake. But inside the private intensive care wing, everything slowed down to heartbeats and breathing monitors. Charlotte Whitmore regained consciousness just after 1:17 in the morning. At first, she only noticed the silence. No applause, no investors, no cameras. Just the faint hum of hospital equipment and the ache of exhaustion pressing against her body like wet sand. She blinked slowly toward the ceiling, trying to piece together fragments of memory. The ballroom, the speech, the lights. Then fear, sharp and sudden. Her breathing quickened slightly. A nurse near the doorway stepped forward immediately. "Easy, Miss Whitmore. You are safe." Charlotte swallowed carefully. Her throat felt dry. "What happened?" The nurse hesitated for half a second. "You experienced a severe neurological reaction, but you are stable now." Stable. The word sounded strangely fragile coming from someone else's mouth. Charlotte turned her head slowly toward the darkened window beside her bed. Rain still streaked softly across the glass outside. "The doctor," she whispered weakly. "Where is the doctor?" The nurse smiled faintly. "Which one?" Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Even now she remembered the calm voice cutting through the chaos while everyone else argued. The man who stayed calm. The nurse's expression softened with recognition. "Dr. Brooks." Charlotte opened her eyes again immediately. "Is he still here?" He was. The nurse adjusted the blanket near Charlotte's arm carefully. "He stayed until your vitals stabilized." Charlotte stared quietly at the ceiling. Something unexpected tightened in her chest. Gratitude felt unfamiliar to her when it arrived without transaction attached to it. "Did he say anything?" The nurse smiled again. "Only that you needed rest." Charlotte let out a weak breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Of course. No dramatic speech, no self-congratulation, just rest. The door to the room opened softly a moment later, and Charlotte's assistant, Rachel, hurried inside, looking exhausted and emotionally wrecked. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath swollen eyes. "Oh, thank God," Rachel whispered immediately. Charlotte looked toward her slowly. "You look terrible." Rachel almost laughed through the tears. "You scared 10 years off my life." Charlotte managed the faintest smile before her expression turned serious again. "Where is Dr. Brooks?" Rachel paused. "He left about 20 minutes ago." Something in Charlotte's face shifted almost imperceptibly. Disappointment. Small but real. "He has a daughter," Rachel added quietly. "He needed to get home before she woke up for school." Charlotte stared at her. "A daughter?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I overheard him calling her from the hallway." Her voice softened. "He sounded different." Charlotte frowned slightly. "Different how?" Rachel looked toward the rain beyond the hospital windows. "Like the world had not exhausted him yet." The words settled heavily into the room. Charlotte looked down at her own hands, resting against the hospital blanket. Steady now. Alive. Hours earlier, those same hands had trembled beneath ballroom lights, while a room full of accomplished people failed to see her as anything except power, wrapped in designer fabric. But that quiet doctor from Mississippi had looked at her once and noticed she was afraid. Not important, not wealthy, afraid. Charlotte swallowed hard against the sudden emotion rising unexpectedly in her throat. Rachel reached carefully into her bag and placed something small beside the hospital bed. Elijah's old brown coat, folded neatly. Charlotte stared at it in silence. Rainwater still darkened parts of the fabric near the shoulders. And for reasons she could not fully explain, it looked more comforting than anything else in the room. 3 days later, Charlotte Whitmore stood in front of a wall of glass overlooking Manhattan, while her board of directors argued behind her like distant static. "The investors are nervous. We need to control the narrative. The treatment program cannot leak to the media." Voices rose and collided inside the executive conference room, but Charlotte barely heard any of it. Her fingers rested lightly against the cool glass while rain drifted across the skyline again in soft gray lines. Since leaving the hospital, everyone had treated her like something fragile wrapped in money. Assistants monitored her schedule by the hour. Lawyers reviewed liability exposure. Doctors spoke carefully around her, as though fear itself might trigger another collapse. Nobody asked how she actually felt. Nobody except him. Charlotte turned suddenly toward Rachel near the conference table. "Find Dr. Brooks for me." The room fell quiet immediately. One board member frowned. "Charlotte, with respect, we already have the top neurological specialists in the country reviewing your condition." "I did not ask for another specialist." Her voice stayed calm, controlled, but colder now. I asked for Dr. Brooks. 48 hours later, Charlotte sat alone in the back seat of a black SUV, leaving Manhattan behind. The city slowly dissolved into smaller roads, rusted gas stations, faded church signs, and long stretches of Mississippi highway wrapped in humid summer air. Rachel sat beside her, reviewing notes from a tablet. His clinic receives almost 60% uninsured patients, she explained quietly. He refused 3 private hospital offers over the last decade. Charlotte looked out the window silently. Why? Rachel hesitated. Nobody seems completely sure. The SUV eventually turned onto a narrow, rural road lined with old oak trees bending beneath heavy heat. Charlotte stared out at small houses with peeling paint, children riding bicycles beside gravel driveways, and tiny family-owned stores that looked forgotten by time. Nothing about this place resembled the polished world she came from. Yet somehow it felt more real than most rooms she had entered in years. The clinic appeared at the end of the road, almost modest enough to miss. White brick, faded blue awning. A hand-painted sign that read Brooks Family Health Center. No marble floors, no security team. Just people waiting quietly on old wooden benches outside beneath slow spinning fans. Charlotte stepped out of the SUV carefully. The humid air wrapped around her immediately. Nobody recognized her at first. An older woman near the entrance smiled warmly anyway. You here to see Dr. Brooks, honey? Charlotte blinked slightly at the kindness. Yes. You are going to wait a bit. The woman chuckled softly. Everybody needs him today. Charlotte glanced through the clinic window. Inside, Elijah moved calmly between patients wearing rolled-up sleeves and a loosened tie. No spotlight, no applause, just quiet, steady work. A little boy cried softly while Elijah crouched beside him, holding a toy dinosaur in one hand and a stethoscope in the other. You hear that? Elijah whispered gently. That dinosaur says you are braver than your daddy, the boy sniffled. Really? Absolutely. Dinosaur never lies. The child laughed through tears immediately. Charlotte watched the moment through the glass without moving. No performance lived inside Elijah Brooks. That was what unsettled her most. Kindness looked different when nobody rich was watching. Rachel lowered her voice carefully beside her. There is more. She handed Charlotte a thin folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings, hurricane relief photos, emergency shelter records, volunteer service awards Elijah never claimed publicly. One article stopped Charlotte cold. Doctor declines major hospital position to raise daughter after wife's death. Charlotte stared at the grainy photograph beneath the headline. A younger Elijah holding a little girl on his hip outside a small rural clinic. Tired eyes, gentle smile. She swallowed hard, unexpectedly. Through the clinic window, Elijah looked up briefly and finally noticed her standing outside beneath the Mississippi heat. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Elijah smiled softly in quiet surprise while Charlotte realized something terrifying. For the first time in years, she had met a man whose life was not orbiting money, and she had no idea how to talk to someone like that. There are places in America where people still look each other in the eye when they say thank you. Charlotte Whitmore noticed that, almost immediately, inside Elijah Brooks's clinic, patients greeted him by name when they entered. Elderly men tipped old baseball caps toward him. Mothers relaxed the moment he walked into examination rooms, carrying that same calm, steady energy she remembered from the ballroom floor in Manhattan. Nobody here cared that he had once published medical research studied across the country. Nobody cared that he had saved the life of a billionaire chief executive officer 3 nights earlier. To them, he was simply the doctor who stayed late when children got fevers after midnight. The doctor who answered emergency calls during storms. The doctor who remembered birthdays and allergies and whose husband had lost work at the mill last winter. Elijah stepped out from the treatment hallway carrying a paper cup of coffee and smiled when he reached Charlotte. You came a long way for hospital food and broken air conditioning. Charlotte surprised herself by laughing softly. I have seen worse. That bad in New York? Worse? She admitted quietly. They stood near the reception desk for a moment, while ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. Through the open windows came the sound of cicadas humming beneath thick Mississippi heat. Everything about this place moved slower than Charlotte's world. Strangely, her breathing felt easier here. Elijah glanced toward the black SUV parked outside the clinic. You probably scared half this county driving in with tinted windows like that. Charlotte folded her arms lightly. I am not usually popular with strangers. Elijah tilted his head slightly. You were not strangers to them. Charlotte frowned. What does that mean? Elijah nodded toward the waiting room, where an older man sat holding a faded veteran's cap against his chest. People around here know what it feels like when life gets hard. His voice stayed soft. That usually makes them kinder. The sentence landed somewhere deep inside her before she could defend herself from it. Rachel quietly stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving the two of them alone near the reception desk. Elijah took a sip of coffee while reviewing handwritten patient notes balanced against his arm. Charlotte watched him carefully. You really turned down major hospitals to stay here? Elijah smiled faintly without looking up. Depends how dramatic the newspaper wanted the story to sound. But you did. Yes. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. Why? Elijah finally looked at her then. Honest eyes. Tired eyes. Because my daughter had already lost one parent. Silence settled gently between them. Not awkward. Just real. And somewhere down the hallway, a little girl laughed while an old radio played soft country music near the nurse's station. Charlotte glanced around the clinic again. The chipped paint, the crowded waiting room, the tired ceiling fans fighting summer heat. You could have had everything, she said quietly. Elijah's expression softened almost sadly. Depends what you mean by everything. Charlotte did not answer immediately, because for the first time in years, she was no longer sure she understood the word herself. Elijah checked the old watch on his wrist and looked toward the hallway. Naomi gets out of school in 30 minutes. You want to meet the reason I never left Mississippi? Charlotte blinked softly at the warmth in his voice. Before she could answer, a nurse hurried quickly from the back office carrying a stack of faxed medical reports. Dr. Brooks, she said nervously. These just came through from St. Vincent. Elijah frowned slightly and accepted the papers. Charlotte watched his expression change as he scanned the first page. Not panic. Worse. Recognition. His eyes lifted slowly towards Charlotte. This cannot be right, he murmured. Charlotte felt cold suddenly, despite the heavy summer heat pressing through the clinic windows. What is it? Elijah looked back down at the report again, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The medication they gave you before the gala. His voice dropped lower now. Someone altered the dosage.